Why are there so many gods in Hinduism, and so many gods in polytheism also? Answer to this question applies both to paganism, and particularly Indo-European paganism, as well as Hinduism, as both spiritual systems derive from the same common root. Before I go into why Hinduism has so many gods and goddesses, I first want to define what a god or a goddess is. Gods are merely hyper-attenuated aspects of human behavior, forces of the consciousness and cosmos, just extended into power archetypes in order for us to better understand our own place, both spiritually, personally, psychologically, and within that of the overall mechanisms of the cosmos. They are us projected into a mythological power form so as to make our lives easier to comprehend and to determine our own path in life via development and ongoing understanding of our own monomyth. This is what these gods and goddesses ultimately represent. Some Hindus believe they are literal beings, just like some pagans in the past believed that Athena, Jove, the Morrigan, and so on were actual beings. But that's not always the common case. The beauty of polytheism and religions like Hinduism is that when a person becomes more enlightened and educated, rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater and becoming atheists, they develop a more complex and specific understanding of their gods and goddesses. They move from being fairy tales to psychological keys to the dynamics of their personality. And this is why even the most highly educated Hindus remain Hindus. And this is why the most highly educated pagans of the classical world, despite all their education, science, technology, philosophy and understanding, remained pagans. They transformed their understanding of their gods and goddesses from mythological fairy tales into power archetypes of human dynamics. Regarding Hinduism, it's extremely difficult to codify and explain. Hinduism is not a religion in the sense you would associate the word religion within Abrahamic and monotheistic structures. Its existence bypasses human consciousness in many ways, so no one single approach is able to encapsulate its basic concept and philosophy. Hinduism is more akin to a way of life. Going back to the time of the shamans and the proto-shamans, the druids, and the earliest versions of human religion and spirituality, the religious consciousness has continually enriched these ideas. Hinduism, like paganism, constantly evolves. This is why there have been Hindu gods which have evolved as late as the 1970s and become venerated. One day there will be Hindu space gods, Hindu internet gods. Just like if paganism still existed, we would still be archetypally encapsulating these new experiences within new pagan gods. And there's a big case to be made for the fact that the likes of Cthulhu and these other ideas derived from literature are encapsulations of emerging gods to keep up with the dynamics of social development within the West. The same could apply to things such as Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, and so on. Hinduism takes this idea but keeps it relevant within the development of the religion. These are known as Vedic gods, and they eventually became established in India as a result of the amalgamation of concepts brought in by migrants from the Indo-European world and that of the indigenous people who lived in the Hindu Kush before this arrival, and even ideas brought in by Alexander the Great and the Greek invasion or the Macedonian invasion, however you stand, also impacted heavily upon this, as did monotheistic ideas from the Mughals and so on, when they brought Sunni Islam into the Indian subcontinent. The earliest written texts are known as the Vedas, and in these the deities were visualized as being human or animal, very common again with paganism. But no one really knows whether they were worshipped in the form of images. It's more likely and it's possible that they were seen as non-anamorphic or zoomorphic beings, almost like the idea of Lucifer just being light, phosphorus. In order to reach out and to spread these spiritual ideas among the populace, it does make sense to have them anamorphized or zoomorphized into human or animal forms. In India, within the lower castes, they tended to worship the images in human or animal form. See what I said earlier about the more educated one becomes, the less likely you're to see these things as fairy tales and more as psychological motifs. And this idea gradually spread upwards to higher sections of society. Why? Because it worked. The idea of visualizing a god force as an image actually makes it very powerful in terms of communicating the idea to the populace. Much later in time, the Vedic gods were given human form and reproduced as images. As this idea developed, the old Vedic religion underwent vast changes, chiefly concerned with gods they worshipped in the forms of ritual. Some of these gods changed their function or gained or lost popularity. Again, Hinduism, like all polytheism, is an evolving idea. Along with this change, things such as meditation between the god and the devotee became taken over as by the Brahmin classes, who performed the necessary rites and rituals. A lot of this had to do with the fact that people in an agricultural society were constantly working because of the large demands of manpower. Therefore, you couldn't spend all the time in the temple meditating between the gods and your own personal life. And as with the Druids of the pagan Celtic world, they became intermediaries. And of course, this has good and bad aspects to it. This incorporation of the Brahmins made the gods somewhat remote, and from this they became less human and more superhero-like. The older deities then were reduced to lesser positions in the entire pantheon. This may also have been a social reaction against the priest class within the Brahmins and how they were venerating and monopolizing relationships towards these deities. However, it has to be said that in time an equilibrium did develop where a more satisfying relationship between the worshippers and the worshipped developed. A new devotional system called Bhakti generated a personal god, and it's connected to the desire for images, which would make the deity more approachable. And we see this also in Nordic paganism, where gods such as Thor, not only do they have great superpowers, but you can also feel they could have a beer with them. They're like you, they're humans. They're again hyper attenuated aspects of human consciousness. Although this process of a more personal relationship with these deities was slow and took time, interestingly, the earliest references to these images for worship is around the 5th century BC, and it mainly involves the Yakshas, which were tree spirits, and the Nagas, which were snake gods. Again, the connection with Indo-European archetypes is undeniable there. From this, the super deities also developed. Two great epics of Indian literature, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, were stories that were secular in nature, but they not only described the feats of these heroes, but referred to the influences that the gods had on their own personal mythology. So very similar to the Eddas of the Norse world, again, Indo-European paganism. The stories of the gods were expanded, altered, and were woven into these narratives, and the heroes themselves got assimilated just like the Nordic gods within mainstream Hinduism and became deified. Same thing would have happened in Ireland with the Celtic gods. Cuchulainn, the Morrigan, Queen Maeve were probably based on real people, as was perhaps Odin, but eventually their legend became gods. Remember what Crowley said? Every man and woman is a star. Some men and women become entire galaxies. From this you had the development of the Puranic deities. This again came from cultural and social changes within Hindu society, and also an increase in the number of gods within the overall pantheon. There was a process of absorption and combination, adopting popular and including a greater incorporation of female deities. Overall pantheon became sophisticated, complex, but highly developed and organized, with several deities then merged into one. Eventually a minor Vedic deity Vishnu was identified with Vasudeva and another epic commonly known as Krishna. It is likely then that the 10 avatars of Vishnu, or his incarnations, eventually became conventional and were attributed to him in the same manner, constantly changing, constantly adapting, constantly growing. Krishna then got assimilated and was then seen playing a flute. This musical deity then became the subject of poetry, art and legends. Around the same time in the 5th century BC, a very ancient fertility god Shiva was elevated to the higher ranks of the pantheon and became a highly important god in a variety of forms that made him as popular as Vishnu. Both Vishnu and Shiva were both conceptualized as forming a triad, again that's Indo-European paganism, with Brahma. Brahma comes from an ancient proto-spiritual form, although he never received or was subject to the same levels of devotion enjoyed by both Vishnu and Shiva. But this could change in the future. This again is how Hinduism and Polytheism paganism develops. Around the 4th or 5th century AD, attempts were made to create some kind of organizational structure out of the myths and legends which had evolved around all these different gods and goddesses. This became known as the Puranas, translates as the ancient epics, incorporating and compiling and amalgamating all that is known about the gods and their elaborate stories, genealogies, various spiritual instructions concerning their veneration. Again, as a result of this, many of these gods who may have been ambiguous or less formalized in an anamorphic or zoomorphic sense became highly structured as a result of increasing awareness of the Punas and incorporation of the Punas within central Hinduism. From this we got Tantraism. This emphasized the cult of male and female. The female partner, the Shakti, in association with the male deity, in most cases Shiva. From the 15th century onwards, a revival then took place of the Bhakti movement by the widespread and growing devotion to Krishna. A lot of this has to do with the fact that Krishna was one of the earliest gods that was transformed from a power source into a highly humanized version. The creative powers of India's religious foundation have never declined, and the same power and veneration towards these Hindu gods is as strong as ever. As late as the 1970s, in parts of northern India, a new goddess called Santoshi Mata appeared, complete with her own epics and legends. This brings up another question that people ask: why do Hindu gods have so many arms? This is because image worship made its way into Indian religions and was finally codified to a certain extent in religious scriptures such as Puranas. And from this, the rituals for their individual worship become described in greater details. From this process, the merging of one or two deities was that some of the gods and goddesses had numerous qualities and magical and spiritual capabilities. This created a visual problem for the artist or the sculptor when visualizing these gods or goddesses. So to overcome this, they were given multiple arms, and each one of these arms would hold an object which would represent a certain quality or aspect symbolized by the object in the hand of each particular deity. Also, some hands would be empty, but the position of the fingers and the palms would then signify the character of the god. So a good example of this was, if the fingers are pointing towards the ground, it means that the god is of a compassionate and giving nature. But if the fingers are pointing upward as a blessing, they signify a protective god. These gestures symbolized their individual powers and allowed worshippers to determine the attributes of one god or goddess from another.